And if I told you that there was a God as powerful as Yahweh, but was it erased from sacred history, an African God wrapped in mystery, strength, and ancestral wisdom, who dared to challenge the supremacy of the God of Israel? Is it crazy to imagine that the scriptures were edited, manipulated, and rewritten to hide their existence? Or are there deep truths buried under the rubble of time? Truths that put in check everything you have ever heard in the pulpits, altars, and religious books. Today, let's dive into one of the most hidden mysteries of the Bible, something that challenges logic, traditional theology, and the millennial silence of religious institutions. A secret that involves African spirituality, biblical censorship, and the deliberate suppression of a sacred name. We are not talking about legends. We are talking about records, forgotten traces, evidence that some would prefer to never be brought to light. Why does the Bible never mention the African gods in the same detail as the Babylonians or Egyptians? Why were certain names erased from the oldest manuscripts? And the most intriguing, who was this God who dared to put himself before Yahweh? A spiritual enemy, a heavenly rival, or just a deity of a culture that tradition tried to silence forever? You are about to find that not everything that has been sacred remained written, and that the spiritual history of humanity may be much richer and more African than many want to admit. Get ready to see with other eyes what you have always been before you, but hidden between the lines. What was erased may be more revealing than what was preserved. And when you understand who this forgotten God was and why he was banned from Scripture, perhaps never can read the Bible the same way. And now, let's get into the roots of this mystery. But first, I need your attention for a few more seconds. If this theme has already moved your beliefs with what they have taught you since childhood, so it's because you are exactly where it should be. This video is not just another content, it is a journey of discovery, an invitation to question what has always been accepted as absolute. So I want to know your opinion. Have you heard of some African god who was erased from Scripture? Do you believe that certain knowledge have been censored to protect a dominant narrative? Leave in the comments. I read everyone and want to know how this theme resonates in your heart. And if you got here, leave the like right now. It helps YouTube understand that this content has value and shows me that you want more videos like this. Subscribe to the channel activates the notifications, because what comes next is even more revealing. Let's open the curtains together and see what has been hidden for centuries. Ready to continue? Most people who read the Bible superficially have the impression that the spirit world revolves only around Israel, Yahweh, and its prophets. But the truth is that between the holy text, there is another story, a silent but powerful presence, biblical Africa. And when we talk about Africa in Scripture, we are not just talking about geography, we are talking about spiritual influence, divine ancestry, kingdoms that not only coexisted with Israel, but who had their own gods, their own prophets, and their own codes of millennial wisdom. The Kush region, for example, repeatedly appears in the Bible. Kush was a territory that extended beyond what we today call Sudan and Ethiopia. In Genesis, the river that came out of Eden bathed the land of Kush, which already gives us an indication of its spiritual importance. This is not a random mention. There is a deep intention behind every name quoted in the scriptures. And when Africa is mentioned, it is because its presence was felt and feared. Ethiopia, in turn, was seen as a kingdom of power. The very book of the Psalms declares, "Ethiopia will extend your hands to God." Why would the psalmist make such a statement? What was the spiritual strength of Ethiopia that made it recognized even by the Hebrews as a land that connected with the divine? This is where we begin to understand that there was much more happening on the banks of biblical history than what canonical texts allowed us to see. We can't ignore Egypt, of course, but unlike many imagine, Egypt was not just the villain of history. It was a spiritual superpower. The Egyptians spoke to the gods, saw the world as a reflection of the cosmos, and had a deep understanding of soul, post-mort judgment, and rituals of spiritual protection. The Jewish tradition drank from many of these sources, even though he tried to erase the footprints. But there were other names, other deities, names who did not even come to us because they were scratched, excluded, prohibited. Among these entities, he was the African god whose name was banned from the scriptures, worshipped by a people whose connection with the invisible was so intense that threatened the spiritual structures of the official narrative. This god was not a demon, it was not a force of evil. He was respected, worshipped, and, according to some records that survived, even feared by the Hebrews themselves. Can you imagine the impact this would have on traditional faith if they found out that Yahweh wasn't the only one to be revered with fear and reverence, that there was another with comparable power which was deliberately silenced? This kind of questioning bothers you because it forces us to get out of the comfort zone, but it is necessary. Because if we want to understand what is really in Scripture, we also need to see what was taken from them. The apocryphal texts, those that have been excluded from religious councils over the centuries, are one of the keys to this mystery. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and even manuscripts of the Dead Sea bring clues of a much broader spiritual reality than the official. Some of these writings speak of entities of light that did not belong to the sky of Israel. Others mention ancient powers that commanded nations even before the emergence of Abraham. And here is the most sensitive point. Many of these entities are associated with Africa. Neighboring cultures such as the Nubic peoples, the southern Canaanites, and the Egyptians themselves knew of the existence of this divinity, not as a myth, but as a real presence. There are oral records, symbols, and archaeological traces that point to a cult that spread throughout the Nile region to the southern end of Ethiopia, a silent but persistent cult. A service that revered a being of justice, fire of war, but also of wisdom, characteristics that curiously are also attributed to Yahweh in their most fearsome aspects. And the most disturbing? Some scholars, both religious and secular, believe that certain names that appear in the Bible as demons or unclean spirits can actually be distorted remnants of this African god, as if, to erase their memory, they had to turn it into something feared, cursed, misleading. An act that we have already seen with various spiritual figures throughout history, especially when they involve black or indigenous cultures. There is a pattern. Whenever an ancestral deity challenges the status quo, it is demoted. From God, he becomes an idol. From an idol, he becomes evil spirit, and then disappears from the scriptures, but not of the soul of the people. And that is why even today, in some regions of Africa and even the Caribbean, there are secret cults that keep the memory of this entity alive. Not always with the same name, not always with the same rituals, but with the same essence, with the same fire that lit millennial altars long before the missionaries arrived. These cults, often called syncretism, are actually guardians of truth that time has not been able to destroy. And maybe only perhaps this video is helping you to see that what they called heresy, it may actually be the key to the restoration of your spiritual identity. We are not here to promote spiritual rebellion, but to seek the truth. Because when we understand that the divine is not stuck in one way, we begin to realize that we were made for a much deeper connection than we imagined. And are you prepared to know the name that was forgotten? Are you ready to hear the voice that echoed between Cush's hills, between the dunes of Egypt, between the rivers of Ethiopia? Are you ready to touch a mystery that can forever change your perception of the spirit world? If this is moving you, I want you to comment now. Truth can't be erased. Leave this phrase in the comments. And if you have heard of some African entity that intrigues you, share with us as well. Your comment can open someone else's eyes. Let's continue. because what comes next is even more revealing. But who was this African god who dared to challenge Yahweh? What kind of entity had enough power to make scribes, priests, and theologians decide to eliminate him from Scripture? To answer this, we need to give up the limited and westernized view that many carry about African deities. Forget for a moment everything that told you about paganism, idolatry, or superstition. Here we are talking about a real spiritual force, worshipped by a millennial people, with sacred rituals, moral codes, and a worldview as complex as any known religious system. This god, according to reports that escaped censorship, was known by a name that echoed between the priests of Kush and the elders of Ethiopia. Its real name, although fragmented by the century, it was pronounced with reverence and fear, as someone who held the secret of creation and the key to justice. It was not just a local god. It was the spiritual center of a people who saw in him not only a creator, but a defender, a judge, a fire that consumed injustice and protected the innocent. He was invoked in times of war, but also in the rituals of birth and death. His presence was invoked through songs, geometric symbols, and stone inscriptions that are still ignored today by traditional archaeologists. The oral tradition of the people of the Nile says that this god walked among men, not with monstrous appearance, but with an aura so intense that the eyes could not face him for long. He was represented with human traits, but his skin was from a bright black man, and from his mouth a hot breath came like the Sahara wind. Some say he spoke all tongues at the same time. Others claim that their voice made enemies fall to their knees. He was the symbol of African sovereignty over the spiritual plane, and at the same time, a being who taught the ways of balance, honor, and respect for the cycles of nature. Interestingly, many of the attributes of this god resemble characteristics that the Bible itself associates with Yahweh. Consumer fire, thunder voice, eyes that see everything, a presence that causes fear. This is no coincidence. Semitic and African cultures were constantly exchanged, and it is perfectly possible that divine concepts crossed, merged, and even competitive. But while Yahweh consolidated his hegemony through Hebrew tradition, this other god was silenced, perhaps because it represents a threat to the doctrinal control that the scribes sought to impose. The worship of this African god was not made in monumental temples such as those of Egypt, but in circular altars outdoors, always in contact with natural elements. The fire represented its righteousness, the water symbolized its wisdom, the earth was the symbol of its faithfulness, and the air, the breath of its invisible presence. The rituals were led by men and women, priests and priestesses, all with spiritual authority. This in itself was already revolutionary for the time, since most of the region's patriarchal religions excluded the feminine from central spiritual functions. In the ceremonies, there was no blood sacrifices. What was offered were songs, dances, and natural perfumes. The belief was that this god was pleased with the sound of sincerity, the purity of intention, the ancestral rhythm. It required no fear of pain, but reverence for the connection. This worship taught that each human being carried a divine spark, and that the mission of life was to awaken this spark, to collaborate with the harmony of the cosmos. See how this connects with the concept of image, and like God described in Genesis. Did this doctrine not subtly infiltrate the foundations of Judeo-Christian faith? Legends tell that this god appeared to leaders of his nation in dreams, visions, and even unexplained natural phenomena. There are records in oral lightning traditions that descended from the sky and left marks on the ground, of voices that arose out of nowhere in the desert, of wild animals that knelt in reverence during the rituals. These stories, for many, are just myths. But what if they are memories of a real presence, suppressed by fear of what she could represent? When we compare this god with other figures of Semitic mythologies, we notice something disturbing. He was not inferior. On the contrary, in many ways, their performance was closer to the more pedagogical, more spiritual people. While Moloch required human sacrifices and Baal associated with storm and dominion, this African god was invoked for protection, justice, and wisdom. He did not ask for blood, but conscience. He did not dominate by force, but taught by example. This, for a culture that wanted to consolidate fear as the basis of obedience, was unacceptable. A God who awakens man instead of submitting him, a God who shares spiritual power with his followers. That was a threat. And perhaps that's why your name has been removed from official records. Perhaps the scribes preferred to call him a strange spirit or include him in texts only as an idol of the peoples around Israel. This would explain why some names appear briefly in genealogies and then disappear, why certain places considered sacred by Africans were associated with curse. The erasure was not just literal, it was symbolic. Delete the name was to erase the memory, and erase memory was to prevent the people to recognize their own spiritual origin. But the memory resists. It survives in the rituals of the villages, the prayers of the elders, the songs preserved in almost extinct languages. And today perhaps he is manifesting himself again through his curiosity, his search for answers, his vantard of going beyond the surface. Because the spirit of truth cannot be suppressed forever. If this content is messing with you in any way, if it is opening reflection spaces you had never accessed before, I want you to tell me this in the comments. Right there. I want to know the truth that was erased. And if you've heard of an African god who doesn't appear in the Bible, he mentions the name in the comments. Maybe other people are also looking for the same answers as you. Want more revelations like this? So hold firm, because what comes next will make you even more impressed. Now that you have had a glimpse of who this mysterious entity was, this African god, so revered by millennial cultures, we need to dive into an even more intriguing question. Why did he challenge Yahweh? Why, among all the deities that coexisted in antiquity, was it exactly this figure that became the target of exclusion, erasure, forced silence? The answer is between the lines of spirituality and the invisible conflicts that shaped the history of faith. We are not just talking about a cultural clash. We are talking about a deep spiritual confrontation with powerful theological implications that still echo in the religious structures we know today. What many ignore is that the Bible does not happen in a spiritual vacuum. The biblical world was a true field of battle between heavenly forces, entities that presented themselves with light, with knowledge, with authority. And within this reality, Yahweh was not the only deity in operation. He was the God of Israel, yes, but other peoples with equally rich and sophisticated cultures also claimed to communicate with the divine. And this African god, whose name was erased, not only coexist, but dared to position himself as a spiritual voice before Yahweh. But what would this challenge be? Are we facing a clash of divine egos? From a conflict between good and evil, how were many taught to believe? Or are we dealing with a deeper paradox? The paradox between authority and consciousness, between imposed light and awakened light. The challenge was not necessarily war, it was theological, it was philosophical. While Yahweh demanded absolute fidelity, centralizing worship itself, this other god offered freedom of conscience, spiritual autonomy, and a more direct connection with the essence of being. In other words, while Yahweh said, "I am the only one," this African god said, "You are also an image of the divine." We live in an extremely difficult era when prophecies come true, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. This is why I made available my digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately via the first pinned comment. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and change your life. Go to the first pinned comment to get your copy, because it remains very little and it will soon be withdrawn. Do not waste time. Click now and make sure your digital copy. Imagine the impact of this difference. A people guided by fear, strict rituals, and highly controlling legal codes, and another people being taught that the sacred dwell within each one, that contact with the Creator can happen without intermediaries, that the path to divinity is internal, personal, and above all, free. Of course, this spiritual proposal would be seen as a threat to the theocratic authority that Yahweh represented within the structure of Israel. And that's when the confrontation began, not necessarily in the fields of war, but behind the scenes of the spiritual thinking of antiquity. Apocryphal records and oral traditions preserved in parts of Africa speak of visions where this African god challenged the imposed dogmas, saying that divine truth could not be monopolized by a single people or a single name, that there were multiple ways to light, and that heaven was not the property of any nation. This, for the Hebrew model, was intolerable, because Yahweh's project was based on exclusivity. I am the Lord, your God, who took you out of Egypt. You will have no other gods before me. This commandment, in essence, is a statement of war against any other spiritual expression. But what happens when another god, with his own authority, with history, with culture, with legitimate worship, says, I am, when he gets up before the heavenly throne and states, I am not an enemy, but I do not submit? This is more than rebellion. It is a paradigm rupture. And that is why the confrontation was interpreted as heresy, as an affront, as a rebellion. And in the theological world of the Old East, there was no room for coexistence. Or you folded, or it was erased. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important to buy it quickly before the copies are exhausted. Paradoxes become even more complex when we analyze the symbols associated with this conflict. Light and darkness, for example. In many African cultures, darkness is not a symbol of evil. It is the womb of creation. It is in the dark that the seed germinates, that the fetus grows, that wisdom forms in silence. Light, on the other hand, is revelation but also exposure. The balance between light and darkness is essential. In the Hebrew tradition, darkness is now associated with evil, sin, the absence of God. And this creates a distortion that demonizes a whole system of belief that sees in darkness a sacred place. Thus, an African god with black skin, worshipped at night, in silent rituals under the moon, it would quickly become a symbol of something dangerous, even though I never did any harm. This is the paradox of the rebellion. When a being refuses to submit to the imposition of a single model of faith, he automatically becomes a rebel. But is every rebellion evil? Or are there rebellions that arise from the need to preserve the spiritual truth being stifled? The challenge of this African god may not have been against Yahweh, but against the human claim to limit God to one image, one name, to a single doctrine. And here is the deepest point of this question. Was he erased from the scriptures for threatening Yahweh or for threatening the system? Because you see, a God who says to the people, you are free to think, to feel, to seek the truth within you, weakens the power of those who want to control by faith. And this, more than any spiritual confrontation, is the real reason for so many gods have been exiled from history. This confrontation was not visible to human eyes. There were no armies, no swords, but there were editorial decisions. There were meetings of religious leaders who chose which books would remain and which would be burned. There were translations that changed names. There were buried manuscripts. And at the center of all this, an African god who dared to say, I am too. And now, after centuries, your voice seems to come back. It reappears in the questions of those who watch videos like this, who feels that there is something beyond what has always been taught, who is really thirsty. Because deep down, we all ask ourselves, do we know the whole story? Is the Bible, as we have today, is the complete portrait of divine revelation? Or is it just a part, carefully selected, a much broader picture? If this video is teasing something inside you, if you are lighting a light that may be asleep, I want you to share it with me. Write in the comments, "Not every rebel is God's enemy." And if you feel that there are hidden truths that need to be revealed, say that too. This channel is a search space, listening and revelation. And stay with me, because in the next block we will enter an even more surprising dimension of this mystery that has been hidden from us for so long. Now that we understand the spiritual and theological conflict between Yahweh and this forgotten African entity, we need to ask ourselves, if it was really so powerful, so present, and so revered by cultures close to the people of Israel, why did your name simply disappear? Was he really that was completely erased from the scriptures? Or is it, between the lines, in mysterious and misunderstood passages, your presence still echoes, waiting for a close eyes that can decipher what the institutional religion has tried to hide? The answer begins to emerge when we look more carefully to certain verses that at first glance seem disconnected. Verses that mention entities, strange names, foreign gods, and even powers that are not of this world, but are not clearly explained. Why would the Bible mention certain figures only once in a single verse and never talk about them again? Why are their characters quoted only by name without any additional context, as if the reader should already know who they are, or as if the biblical author intended to say something without really saying? An example that arouses suspicions is the verses that speak of the children of God who came to earth and took to themselves the daughters of men. Who were these beings? Would they be angels? Or would it be deities that coexisted with Yahweh and for some reason were later reinterpreted as rebels, fallen, banned? Some scholars believe that these passages, found in Genesis, can be distorted echoes of African deities who were related to the earth, fertility, with the spiritual lineage of humanity. Another subtle trace appears in Isaiah, where we read about a figure named the Powerful of Cush, an expression that many translators avoid exploring deeply. The text is not clear whether to be talking about a king, a nation, or a spiritual force. But the repetition of the words glory, strength, and fear in association with Cush leads us to question, was the prophet talking about a human leader, or making indirect reference to a powerful deity known in that region? And if it was a god, why was the name not preserved? In other excerpts, especially in Psalms and prophets, we find expressions such as gods of other peoples, powers of the southern, spirits who inhabit the desert, and even hidden forces from beyond the Nile. All these expressions seem to point to something or someone that was recognized but not desired in the official canon. They are like shadows left posto, traces that escaped the total censorship. And the most intriguing, they are never clearly refuted. They are only ignored or thrown in the interest to us field. But there is an even more curious case. In the book of Ezekiel, there are constant mentions to Egypt and other African nations being judged by Yahweh. But instead of generic condemnations, the text often alludes to spiritual pride, hidden altars, and sacred snakes that rebelled against light. Here, it is not just common idolatry. These are powerful spiritual rituals enough to be considered an affront to the God of Israel. What exactly did the prophet see in these nations? Why so discomfort? What kind of practices were being made that endanger the temple's spiritual hegemony? And then we have the books that were simply left out of the Bible as we know it today. Apocryphal texts, books taken in the councils, and others who survived only in fragments. The Book of Enoch, for example, mentions heavenly beings called vigilant who came to earth to teach humanity but ended up punished for it. What is striking is that these beings, although punished, are described as carriers of spiritual wisdom and deep connection with creation. And among them, some have names and characteristics that resemble the African god that we are revealing here. Protector, wise, not submissive to the heavenly throne, but not evil. What we are seeing here is a pattern. Whenever a spiritual figure appears that does not fit the molds of Yahweh, but which is not necessarily evil either, it is marginalized, hidden, reduced the symbol of idolatry, or simply ignored. But the tracks are there, like footprints in the sand. And when we look carefully, we realize that this African deity was mentioned, not with his real name, not explicitly, but as a spiritual spectrum that threatened the central narrative of a single, absolute, and exclusive God. And we must not forget the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest passages in the Hebrew Bible. In it, there is an enigmatic mention of gods coming from the south, bringing warmth, wind, and revelation. The south, in this context, has always been associated with Africa. These deities are cited as participants in the spiritual battle, as real presences that manifested themselves among the people. Why no one talks about it? Why, among so many theological studies, do these passages continue to be treated as ancient poetry without doctrinal relevance? The silence is purposeful. What we are showing here is not empty speculation. It is the careful reading of a text that has been carefully shaped to preserve certain truths and suppress others. The presence of the African god in Scripture is subtle but real. It is in fragments, echoes, gaps. It is in the expressions that are not explained, in the names that appear and disappear. It is in the spirits of the southern, in the forgotten powers, in the altars hidden in the hot lands of the desert. And now, maybe you are also starting to see. The Bible is a sacred book, yes, but it is also a book with history, with additions, with interests. And when we understand that, we started reading with other eyes. We started to get the lines. We begin to hear what is whispered behind what is written aloud. If this content made sense to you, if any of these biblical passages I mentioned now resonated inside you, comments down here, "I saw the lines." This phrase will show me, and everyone who reads, that you are seeing beyond the obvious. And if you remember some strange, enigmatic, or seem to hide something, share with us. Together we can assemble this spiritual puzzle that has been hidden for centuries. And it does not leave, because what comes now will scan even more what is behind the veil. After noticing the traces left by this entity in the sacred texts themselves, we need to face one of the most uncomfortable truths of this entire journey. His name was erased, scratched, silenced, not by chance, not by error, but by decision, by conscious choice of men who had the power to decide what would be considered sacred and what would be called heresy. And this is one of the greatest spiritual pains of humanity, discovering that part of the story that told us was in fact written with gaps, with cuts, with spiritual censorship. Yes, the name of this African god was extirpated from Scripture. But before that, he was pronounced in altars, revered in prayers, invoked by priests who saw the manifestation of justice and wisdom. He was not a smaller character. It was an active force, a name that caused fear and reverence. But at some point, this name became too dangerous, too inconvenient, too powerful to coexist with narrative the exclusive that would be promoted in the following centuries. And then someone, or a group of men with religious authority, decided that this name should no longer be remembered, that should disappear. But who are these men who decide what can or cannot be in the Bible? Who gave them the right to choose what is divine and what should be called profane? When we analyze the formation of the biblical canon, we understand that there was a long political, theological, but ideological process. Meetings, councils, disputes. Each book included or excluded from the Bible was not only a result of divine inspiration, but also of interests, religious, cultural, and even military interests. A name that endangered the authority of the God of Israel, or to make room for other spiritual interpretations, was automatically classified as heretical, and so silenced. This process was brutal. Names of African gods, of spiritual entities venerated by peoples who lived with the Hebrews for centuries simply disappeared from the records. Sometimes there was only one vague allusion, a loose verse, a quick mention. Other times, not even that, as if they had never existed, but they existed, were invoked, were feared, and especially they were fought with all their strength by religious institutions that wanted to monopolize the divine truth. This deletion was not just literal, he was spiritual, because by eliminating these names, the right to question, to seek, to compare was also eliminated. The ordinary faithful was stuck with a single source, a single model of divinity, and everything that fled this was automatically classified as idolatry, paganism, or demonic influence. See how this still echoes in current religious discourses. Everything that comes from African spirituality, all that does not carry the seal of Judeo-Christianity, is immediately demonized. It is a direct result of this old erasure, of this millennial censorship that began in the texts and spread through the mentalities. But why so much fear of a name? Because names carry power. A name is a frequency, it is an identity, it is a key. When the name of an entity with faith and reverence is pronounced, a spiritual door opens, and the ancients knew that. Therefore, Yahweh's name was so kept, written with consonants only, forbidden to be said aloud. Similarly, the name of this African god was kept as a sacred secret, but unlike Yahweh, his name was not hidden by zeal, was eliminated by fear. The fear that he would arouse the people, that he would show that there is more than one way to connect with the divine, that his presence revealed that the Holy Spirit can also manifest itself in a drumstick, in an ancestral corner, in a dance around the fire, in a prayer said in forgotten dialects. This was the true fear, that the people would hear the voice of the Spirit again, without depending on mediators, structures, doctrines. And then comes the question you need to ask yourself. Who has the authority to call something heresy? Who can point their finger at a millennial spiritual tradition and say, this is from the devil? What is the criterion used to separate the sacred from the profane? In many cases, the criterion is simple. Everything that is not under the control of the dominant religion needs to be silenced. It is heretical, not because it is false, but because it is uncontrollable. Speaking directly to the spirit of man without asking permission to anyone. And this leads us to a delicate but necessary point. Is some of the figures the Bible calls demons or evil spirits, in fact, spiritual entities of other cultures that were purposely demonized? That would not be something new. History shows that every deity of the enemy has always been demoted to the curse status. What was sacred in one culture becomes abomination in the other. And when a religion assumes political power, it imposes its spiritual codes and erases others. But spiritual memory does not go out with paint. Do not silence with the fire. It remains alive in dreams, visions, in the words that go from generation to generation. And so, even after centuries of censorship, the name of this African god still pulsates into some corners of the earth. It still resonates in ancient songs, still echoes in the forests, in the deserts, in the hearts of those who refuse to accept that the truth can be imprisoned in a single book. The Bible is sacred, yes, but it is not the only expression of the voice of God. And that's why videos like this are so important, because they rekindle questions. They free the thought. They return to people the right to seek and to find it. If you have gotten here, it is because your spirit is responding to this call, to this sound that comes from afar, long before you are born, of a time when spirituality was lived barefoot on the earth, with an open heart, with the awareness that the sacred is not limited to the letter, but vibrates in the invisible. If this content touched you, if you felt that something inside you was activated, I want you to comment now. I want to remember what they tried to make me forget. This phrase will be like a spiritual password, a sign that you are in tune with this search for reconnection, for truth, for liberation. And do not leave, because in the next stretch, we will explore what lost texts and prohibited documents have to say about this hidden presence. Get ready, because the next revelation will leave you without flaw. It is exactly at this point on our journey that the prohibited texts are on the scene, as voices whispering from within forgotten caves. Voices that for centuries were silenced, not for lack of truth, but for excess of it. And among these texts, perhaps none is as revealing as the mysterious and feared book of Enoch, a book that was for a long time rejected, forgotten, and even cursed by religious institutions that knew very well the power he carried. And this is where the connection with the forgotten African god begins to gain even more impressive contours. Enoch's book is not just another apocryphal among so many others. He is actually a key, a spiritual key to understanding what was hidden, distorted, and removed from the Bible as we know it today. Unlike canonical books, the Book of Enoch speaks openly about beings who did not submit to Yahweh, about heavenly entities that descended to the earth, who taught men spiritual secrets and who were directly related to humanity, without the mediation of any temple, any Mosaic law of no official structure. These beings are called vigilantes, and among them there were leaders, bosses, entities with their own names, with unique characteristics. The most intriguing thing is that these names do not appear anywhere else in the traditional Bible. These are officially recognized entities, but in the Book of Enoch are described in depth, with complexity, with respect. Not as demons, but as spiritual beings they chose to go down. They chose to teach. They chose to love. And so they were punished. But what does this have to do with the African god? It has everything, because within these descriptions, often enigmatic, the figure of a being who did not bow before the heavenly throne, not by selfish rebellion, but by faithfulness to a greater mission, to free humanity from ignorance, a being who believed that spiritual knowledge should not be the privilege of the few, but everyone's right. A being that came down to men to teach, to guide, to open his eyes. And in doing so, he placed himself on a collision route with the dominant spiritual powers. What if this being wasn't an angel? What if, in fact, were it an ancestral deity, worshipped by the peoples of Cush, Ethiopia, and regions south of Israel? An African god, later interpreted as a vigilant, only to soften his presence in the records. This would explain why he does not appear in the traditional Bible, but is so present in parallel texts, and why his spiritual mission was reinterpreted as transgression, as disobedience, as error. In the Book of Enoch, these beings are described as those who taught men the secrets of heaven, the movements of the stars, the power of herbs, the use of language, the science of the spirit. But why would this be a sin? Why sharing wisdom would be seen as a spiritual crime? Because knowledge release. And a spiritually free people is a people who are not controlled, does not accept manipulation, do not fear punishment, and so it becomes dangerous. This is the point where spirituality and politics intertwine. What was considered forbidden was not always bad. Sometimes it was just what challenged the power structure. The Book of Enoch, along with other hidden writings, such as the Book of the Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and even certain fragments found among the Dead Sea manuscripts, make up an alternative spiritual mosaic, where other narratives coexist with that of Yahweh, where the divine appears in multiple forms, where the African god, still unnamed explicit, appears in the traits, gestures, in the missions of these forgotten beings. And the implications of this are gigantic, because if we accept that these texts have something true, then we also need to accept that the spiritual history of humanity has been partially told, that there are parts missing, and that these parts have color, have rhythm, have African identity. That divine revelation did not just come from top to bottom, but also from the inside out. That the Spirit manifested not only in the deserts of Israel, but also in the rivers of Ethiopia, in the mountains of Cush, in the forests where African priests chant songs that healed the soul and awakened the spirit. This is why the concealment of these texts is so significant. They were not just ignored, they were fought, were deliberately removed. They were called dangerous. But dangerous to whom? For the truth? Or for those who had something to lose if the people started to see beyond what was imposed on them? And the most disturbing thing is to realize that this concealment continues to this day. Few preachers talk about the Book of Enoch. Few churches recommend your reading. Few theological seminars dare to explore their deep layers. Because it does not fit the mold. Because he opens his eyes too much. Because it brings out the memory of an earlier, more free, more connected, more living spirituality. A spirituality where the sacred needed not be translated, he was meaningful. And that is exactly what many feel when they read these texts for themselves. And discomfort that is actually an awakening, a feeling that they are finding something they always knew but they forgot. A spiritual memory that was suffocated by centuries of doctrine, fear, condemnation, but now, slowly, begins to resurface. If you have come here, if you are listening to these words with an open heart, you are already part of this reunion. You are touching a knowledge that transcends the religious, that crosses time, that rescues, that reconnects, that remembers who you are. If something inside you is saying, I already knew it, even without knowing it, then comments down here, truth calls me by name. And if you have had contact with the Book of Enoch or other apocryphal texts, share your experience. What stretch did you mark you the most? What part did you confront you? Your comment may be the spark that will light up someone else's spiritual search. And get ready, because what comes next is even deeper. Now that we know what has been hidden in books, let's understand how it directly impacts your faith and your current reality. Over the centuries, echoes of this erasure have not only been in the texts, hidden pages, or scratched names. They crossed generations and came to us like cracks in their soul, invisible wounds that profoundly affect the spiritual identity of the African descent people in the modern world. The forced oblivion of this African god, the censorship of his rituals, the criminalization of his practices, and the delegitimation of his spiritual presence left deep marks throughout an ancestral heritage. And perhaps that is why many still today feel that something is missing in the faith they inherited, an absence they cannot explain, but that pulsates like a call inside their chest. How many times black people sat at the seats of the church, heard inflamed sermons, sang praises with all their hearts, but still left with a void that is not a lack of faith, it is lack of identity. Because they learned to love God, but they were taught to reject everything that carries the trace of their own origin. They were taught to fear drums, to condemn dances, to repudiate ancestral languages, to distrust their own body, their own color, their own spiritual strength. Everything that comes from Africa was placed as a shadow, as a suspect, as unholy, as if God had jumped an entire continent by distributing his light. And that generates a spiritual fracture. Because it is not possible to have full faith when it requires you to deny who you are, when it requires you to disconnect from your root to connect to the divine. It is at this point that the erasure of this African god becomes more than a historical problem. It becomes a living wound, bleeding to this day in the religious structures that continue to ignore or even attack everything that refers to African ancestry. And when a people lose their connection with the spiritual who carries their identity, they become vulnerable. Vulnerable to control, oppression, passive acceptance of doctrines that were built to silence it. This deleted god represented more than a cult or a set of rituals. He represented spiritual freedom, represented autonomy, It represented the possibility of listening to God without depending on temples, without submitting to hierarchical religious systems, without having to kneel in the face of a theology that never recognized him as legitimate. The return to the memory of this God is, first of all, a return to the spiritual dignity of the African people. And it bothers you. It bothers because it breaks structures. It bothers because it returns power. It bothers because it activates a reconnection that can no longer be controlled. In recent years, we have seen a silent awakening, and at the same time, powerful. Black young people who begin to question the roots of their faith. Black women who look at their hair, their dances, their ways of celebrating life, and wonder why they were taught to feel ashamed of what their ancestors considered sacred. Black men who, when studying the Bible, realized that spirituality, which was taught to them, deliberately omitted everything that concerned their origins. And this awakening is spiritual. It is ancestral. It is revolutionary. The African descent spirituality, when it is reunited, does not replace the gospel. She deepens him. She enhances him. It returns humanity to faith. It recontents the man of God, not as a miserable servant, but as a worthy, complete spiritual being, legitimate son of creation, a child who does not need to deny his story to accuse himself to his father. And this is the greatest legacy that the erased name of this African God can still offer us, the memory that we have been made in the image and likeness of the divine, even before we know how to pronounce the word Yahweh. But it is not easy to accept this. Many still resist. Many are still afraid. Fear of questioning, fear of seeming heretics, fear of losing acceptance of the religious community they have always attended. But that's exactly why we're here, because fear cannot continue to ruling the spirituality of a people. Because the time has come to heal these wounds with truth, with courage, with listening, and especially with reconnection. Because it is not about abandoning faith, it is about restoring it, to complete it, to make peace with parts of himself who were called sin when they were in fact divine heritage. In many African communities, even those that embraced Christianity, it is still possible to perceive the signs of this ancient presence. Songs that resemble ancestral prayers, baptism rituals performed in rivers, similar to the old rites of water initiation, prayers made in a circle, in community, with rhythm, with body, voice. These manifestations are not empty syncretism. They are spiritual resistances. These are seeds that did not die. These are memories that remain alive, even in the midst of Eurocentrated theology that tried to replace everything with cold formulas and soul-free liturgies. The truth is that the Spirit of God has never been imprisoned, and that's why he keeps blowing where he wants, even among the children and daughters of Africa. And when these children and daughters look into themselves and see a divine spark that was not taught in the banks of the Bible school, but that pulsates hard in the drums of the heart, something begins to change. Prayer gains another tone. Bible reading gains another depth. Praise is no longer imitation and becomes a true expression of the soul. This is how the oblivion begins to be overcome. When someone decides to remember, when someone dares to ask, when someone listens to the inner voice that says, "You are also a temple, you are also an altar, you are also home from the sacred." And that's why videos like this are so important. They are not intended to give all the answers, but they have the power to open paths, return, reunion, healing ways. If you felt that this content spoke to your soul, if at some point you felt shiver, emotion, or clarity, I want you to let it record it. Comment down here, "I am remembering me." This simple and powerful phrase will show that you are on this journey with us. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share it. This spiritual movement makes sense only if it is collective, and together we are just starting. Now let's continue, because the next point of this journey will take you to a question that may never be asked, but it needs to be faced. After all we hear so far, deleted names, censored scriptures, hidden entities, spiritual memories violently pushed into oblivion, we come to an inevitable point of the journey. A spiritual crossroads where each of us needs to face a question that can no longer be ignored. What defines the sacred? And more than that, who has the power to say what revelation is and what is heresy? For centuries, we were taught to accept that all that was between the covers of the Bible was absolute, final, unchanging. We were taught that questioning would be sin, that investigating other texts would be deviation, that hearing the voices of the ancients would be to dodge the way. But what if this path was built with missing parts? What if they told you just part of the truth? What if the revelation was broken in half, and they gave you only half that mattered to those who wanted to keep control? This is the silent wound of institutionalized spirituality. It teaches that there is a single model of holiness, a single way of listening to the voice of God, a single valid spiritual script, and everything else is heresy. But this narrow view creates an abyss where millions of people are outside, feeling guilty of their intuition, their roots, their questions. And the most cruel of this is that many of these people have deep spiritual gifts, sharp intuitions, legitimate calls, but they were convinced that all this was mistake, deviation, or evil influence. And the result is a people have scanned from the essence itself, of spiritual ancestry itself. Why does the sacred always need to look like what Europe has consecrated? Why are the icons of spirituality almost always white, with European traits, with garments that have nothing to do with the climates and cultures where biblical revelation has happened? Why was the divine clinked, Europeanized and standardized? Who is interested in a Jesus with blue eyes instead of an uninvoked Jesus or beauty, the son of a warm land, between people of dark skin and oral culture? What is heresy after all? Is it question? Is it looking for beyond? Is it listening to the elders of the spiritual lineage itself? Is it wondering if that God who was erased from the Bible was not, in fact, a legitimate extension of the same Spirit that we call saint today? If the Spirit of God blows where he wants, as Christ himself said, why could not blow in the forests of Angola, in the mounds of Ethiopia, on the banks of the Nile, between priests who danced around the fire and invoked the divine presence with songs and drums? Revelation cannot be attached to one book. A book is a photograph. But God is movement. God is eternity. God is breathing. And if you close the window to this sacred wind, what you have is just religion, not revelation. Heresy is often not what is sought, but what is refusing to see. And many of those who today point their finger and call heresy everything they do not understand are unknowingly rejecting legitimate parts of the divine revelation itself. Because she didn't come in one tongue. She didn't just speak in Hebrew or Greek. She spoke of ancestral dialects, in rhythms, dances, in symbols. And keep talking. Who defines what is sacred? Who decides that the spiritual experience of a people is not worth? That your way of worshipping, praying, connecting to the invisible is inferior or deceit? The same system that erased the name of the African god also instituted which voices could be heard, and all the others were silent. But now you are listening to these voices. You are feeling the weight of silence. You are realizing that perhaps your faith needs to be rebuilt with the parts that have been hidden. And the most beautiful is to realize that this is not heresy. This is liberation. This is reconnecting. This is reunion with essence. Many today are finding that the sacred has no unique form, that he pulsates inside, that he reveals himself in the details, that he is in the sincere questions as much as in the safe answers. And this consciousness opens doors that were locked with guilt, fear, spiritual manipulation. But now you have the key. Because where there is true search, there is revelation. Where there is a sincere thirst, there is an answer. And where there is the courage to look at what was hidden, there is liberation. Revelation does not end in the books. She is still on you, in your heart, in your spiritual memory, in your direct connection with the divine, a connection that does not need approval from anyone, that does not need to go through doctrinal filters. Which is yours, guys, authentic? So I ask you, with all sincerity, what did you teach you to call heresy? Wasn't it revelation? And what was consecrated as truth, wasn't it control? Who you would be today if you had learned that the divine also dwells in your color, in your culture, your ancestry, that erased God was not a rival of Yahweh, but a reflection of the same spirit manifested in another language. If these words resonated on you, if at some point in this video something made you shiver, made you cry, or just silence inside, I want you to let it record it. Comment here, and if they told me only part of the truth, this phrase will put you in alliance with all who are awakening to a new way of seeing faith, not as prison, but as freedom. And share this video with someone you feel that you also need to remember who you are, that needs to break with the blame and rediscover the revelation. Because what we're going to talk about now can forever change the way you see the Bible and your role inside it. If you have gotten here, take a deep breath, because only those who have the courage to cross all this journey to the end is ready for an even deeper awakening. This already says a lot about you. So now listen to me carefully. Subscribe to the channel right now. It's not just a button. It's a commitment to the truth, to knowledge, to your ancestral spirituality. Activates the bell not to lose any video, because what is coming will take you even more from the shallow. And I want you to comment below, I went to the end because my soul asked for more. Right, just like that. This phrase will connect us and also show who is really in this body and soul search. If you felt that this video has really touched you, leave the like now, because that's what helps this content to reach other people who also need to wake up. And don't stop here, no. The next video that is appearing there on the screen will complete everything you heard today. Click now and continues this journey with us. Your spirit will thank you.